has worked alongside autistic adults for the past 8 years, initially as an occupational therapist and more recently also as a systemic therapist in an NHS service in South London. She explored the relational experiences of autistic parents as part of her dissertation research in 2023. Over to you, Aisling.
You. Hi, my name's Aisling, and I am going to talk to you about my dissertation, which I completed in 2023 as part of my systemic masters. And it is looking at the experiences of adults who are diagnosed autistic after their children are diagnosed autistic. As well, working in an autism service, I have a son who was diagnosed autistic at the age of 2. So I have been through that diagnostic process as a parent, but I don't share the experience of the people I worked with in this research of having my own diagnosis. And so that is a limitation because in the service I work with, co-production is really important. And ideally, this would be co-produced research, but it's not possible within a dissertation. So what I've tried to do is centre the voices of autistic researchers, particularly autistic parents who are researchers. So before I tell you a little bit about that research, I wanted to talk a little bit about the discourses around autistic parenting. So as Dawn said, I'm an occupational therapist by background. And when I initially started working in an autism service as an OT, the main role that people spoke about finding challenges in or finding themselves unsupported in was as parents. They didn't know any other autistic parents most often, and there was no resources out there for autistic parents. That has started to change in more recent years. So an increased number of the people coming to our service for an assessment are parents of autistic children, and more often there is an increased kind of visibility of autistic parents in the media. So a lot of people I work with have spoken about people like Christine McGuinness and Melanie Sykes, how they spoke about their journey to recognizing their experience of autism after their children diagnosed. And that kind of really helped some of the people I worked with just to see some visibility of other autistic parents. So within the literature on autistic parenting, so there is a limited amount of research on autistic parenting, and that fits with the general experience of research around autism, where it has been predominantly about childhood experiences, and the idea of autistic people's experiences across the lifespan have quite often been ignored. So what research does exist, Shona Murphy, who's an autistic researcher, she spoke about the idea that often when research has been done, it's done through a medical lens. So it focuses on things that are difficult, or it focuses on that kind of deficit-based model. And what it doesn't do is pay any attention to what are the joys of being an autistic parent, what are the strengths of being an autistic parent, what are the strengths particularly for autistic children of having autistic parents. Another autistic researcher, Jessie Fletcher Randall, she talked about the implications of this. So the fact that there's a lack of research around autistic parenting, and the fact that what has existed has predominantly been quite, what are the problems, has, as she said, social justice implications for autistic parents. What it means is that autistic parents will often find themselves unrecognized, unsupported, and when they are meeting professionals, they often have had experiences where they're being judged against neuronormative ideas about what parenting looks like by people who don't have any understanding about what it is to be an autistic parent. So it's within that background that I wanted to do my dissertation around the experiences of autistic parents. So I set out to do my research, and I sent purposive invitations to 8 people who were within our service at the time, and 2 people self-identified as meeting the diagnostic criteria. So the questions I wanted to look at were, when people go for an assessment, so we know that it's really hard to get an assessment. You have to go through the barriers of like going to see your GP, who might have misconceptions about what autism would look like. So you have to kind of fight even to get a referral. And then when you do get a referral, you're sitting on a waiting list for a really long time. So my curiosity was like, when parents of autistic children seek an assessment, what are they thinking may be the impact of that assessment? What might be the positives? What might be the challenges? How do they think it might impact on their relationship with their autistic child and other family members? And how, in fact, does it impact? So I met with two people who I'll call Sarah and David. There's some background information about both on the screen. And just to note, as part of the interview process, I asked people what autism descriptor they would use. So I've used people's preferred autism descriptors. So for David, that's having ASD. That's not usually what I would use, but that's what he uses. So that's what would be used when we're speaking about David. So I interviewed both using interpretive phenomenological analysis, and we found kind of 5 what are called group experiential themes. I'm just going to say themes. And then we found like 13 sub-themes. But within kind of the presentation timing, I'm going to talk about 5 of those. So the first one I'm going to talk about is that assessment is exploratory and it takes place in the context of challenge. So before I did this, I had an idea that people would seek an assessment after they recognize their own autism within their child's experience, and that would be the predominant catalyst. And some of the research would suggest it is. But actually, in the case of Sarah and David, I think it's really important that actually both of them spoke about seeking an assessment because they were experiencing personal distress. And they both felt a lack of clarity around what to do, how to move forward. And as Sarah said, what her hope was that an assessment would offer targeted support rather than just trying to fish around. So for both of them, that wasn't something they felt they could get through like kind of identifying as autistic before formalized diagnosis. They felt a formalized diagnosis was needed in order for them to kind of find a way forward. I think that's really important because actually one of the things that really sat with me was actually that kind of perhaps false promise of what a diagnosis might bring in terms of targeted supports. So for both of them, it was a real hope that if they were to be diagnosed, it would mean that they would be able to access something that was helpful and supportive to them. In their case, they did feel that they had been able to access some support, but that's not always the case. So I know for many people, you may get an assessment, have a diagnosis, and at that point you're discharged. So both of them spoke about moving towards assessment after conversations with people who are important to them. So relationships were really important in terms of looking for assessment. Both of them spoke about speaking to friends and speaking to family members about their autistic experiences before they tentatively moved towards assessment. David spoke a lot about speaking with his wife about their autistic son and with his mum about his late father, who they both believe may have had ASD. So he said, I started to think my father may have fallen into this category. And so there's my father, there's Luke, and then there's me. And maybe it's worth looking into this a bit more. So relationships were really important, even just in thinking about what going forward with an assessment. So the second theme was the impact of diagnosis. Both David and Sarah put a lot of thought into seeking an assessment, and yet there were lots of positive and negative impacts of diagnosis that were unexpected for them. For both of them, it changed the stories they told about their past and their future. So how they looked back on relational experiences had changed, and how they thought moving forward had changed. The diagnosis for both of them also changed how they related to family members. And in the main, that was a really positive change and often an unanticipated one. So David again spoke about his relationship with his mother and how he had an increased empathy for her after he received his diagnosis. So he said, understanding some of the challenges I've had and how she's been trying to deal with it, particularly in the context of an environment in which there was zero support, I think I can have a lot more sympathy for some of the decisions she made. So it wasn't just a change within like his relationship with his child, there was a change in his relationship with his mum and a change in how he thought about his relationship with his late father. Sorry. There we go. He also spoke about thinking about his son, thinking about his relationship with his wife, thinking about his relationship with other people in his family, and how with diagnosis had come a sense of meaning. So he said, it's suddenly not all of these random sharp things which don't make sense and don't fit. Suddenly they all fit together, and you can draw a line between them and start making sense of what's going on, and it's not random anymore. For Sarah, there was a different experience relationally from the impact of diagnosis. She spoke about like the unexpected emotional impact of her diagnosis in terms of how she looked back at relationships through the lens of a late diagnosis. She said it makes you question every single life choice you made. And I think it's really important to say that like that wasn't something Sarah felt in any way prepared for going into an assessment. She had been through an assessment process with her son, and so she felt that might have prepared her more for the assessment process, but actually they were entirely different experiences. And as she said, with her child, she said, you're looking back, and with a child, you're not. So both weighed up the benefits and the drawbacks of their experience of diagnosis and thought about whether they would recommend it to another parent who might think about seeking an assessment. And for Sarah, after her own experience, she really wanted people to think about how much of an emotional impact an assessment may have, saying that a diagnosis, it's telling you something quite fundamental about yourself. Both Sarah and David have experienced othering and stigma as autistic parents. And so for David, that was something he really wanted to draw people's attention to. He said, I'd have to say to any parent, there are benefits, but be aware of what the negatives are and make sure you weigh those up before you get yourself a label, which might be, or which almost certainly will be used against you. Again, I've worked in a post-diagnostic service for a number of years, and yet the level of othering that David reported a couple of years later, rather than in the immediacy of diagnosis, like that was something that really sat with me afterwards, and how important he felt it was that people were able to weigh up not just the immediate impact of a diagnosis, but actually what's the impact 2 or 3 years on in your life. So another theme was disclosure and stigma. And again, a relationship to time came into play. So both Sarah and David taught a lot about how to share their diagnosis with others, particularly in light of their experiences of stigma. And for Sarah, this was a new pressure on relationships. And it was one she, again, didn't feel supported around. So she said, sometimes I think I'll tell people. And then I think people might say, when did you get your diagnosis? And then I don't know what to say then, because if I say it was like a couple of years ago, they'll be like, why didn't you tell me earlier? So that added an element to her relationships and how she thought about them that was something that, again, she hadn't been prepared for. And again, she didn't feel like she had a lot of support around now. The last theme I had was autistic experiences storied by societal context. So both David, Sarah, and their children accessed their assessment and diagnosis through NHS services. David additionally sought specialist educational provision through the local authority. And so that relationship impacted his views of being an autistic parent. And Sarah works in services with autistic families. And again, that affected how she saw the experience of being an autistic parent. So with all those contexts in mind, we talked about what they would advise services when working with autistic parents. For Sarah, a really important part was that diagnosticians, people working with autistic parents at the point of diagnosis, think about them in wider contexts. So she said, think about how you speak to someone you know and the impact that's going to have. And then they'll still have to make tea in like an hour. So for her, there was kind of, in her experience of assessment and diagnosis, there was a lack of attention to her as a person outside of the diagnostic process, like her as someone who had responsibilities that she was going to have to manage as soon as the assessment finished. David said, coming back to his experiences of othering, he said, understand the benefits of it. Don't try and lump everyone together. You cease to be an individual. So a real call for people to move away from kind of stereotypes about what it might be to be autistic. Sarah talked a lot about experiences of services for children, and she said what she would like for services working with autistic children to do is when you're talking to a parent, just have at the back of your head, almost assume they're autistic, because then the way you're going to talk to them isn't going to have an impact if they're not autistic, but actually it's just more inclusive. So those are just a couple of the themes that came out of that research with David and Sarah. I'm aware when I'm thinking about this piece of research, there are limitations. It's 2 people, so it's not generalizable. It is really their stories and their experiences. And also that both were white British people, and they were white British people working in professional jobs. So when I think about their experiences of stigma and othering, I was really curious and really quite worried to think, well, what would those experiences have been like if they intersected with other things like racism or poverty or classism? Because they both had really difficult experiences of stigma. And yet both would say, and did say within the wider research, that they had access to a lot of resources when they were liaising with some of the services based on their own kind of experiences in professional contexts, in work contexts. For both of them, despite those experiences of othering, both of them felt the diagnosis had given them a relational framework. It helped them to understand relationships they'd had both in the past and in the present. And it changed their relationships. It changed them in ways that they hadn't anticipated and in really positive ways that they hadn't anticipated. I felt particularly David's stories about his relationship to his mum, which is one he really didn't expect to change. That was a really positive and powerful story for him. So one of my curiosities when I started was what are the benefits of a formalized assessment when it can be so, so difficult and people can wait so long to have an assessment and diagnosis? But for both David and Sarah, the formalized part was really imperative to their sense of well-being and to their relational experiences. And it made differences not just to them, but it made differences to their family and how their family did family. It made a difference to how they related to their family members, and it was something that they both felt really positive about. So I was left thinking about my role as a systemic therapist in terms of how I can work with and support autistic parents, autistic children, autistic families. And one of the primary things I was left with was the importance of challenging the stigma and othering that autistic parents can experience, not just in the therapy room, but outside of the therapy room when liaising with other services. And another important part for me was the idea of being able to provide therapeutic spaces longer term. So a lot of services, including mine, we work with people in the immediacy of diagnosis, but actually it's in the years to come when people are facing challenges, like Sarah said, how do I tell people? What do I tell them? Do I want to tell them? But also that we provide spaces where we can actually just bear witness to the joys, to the strengths, and to the positive experiences of autistic parents and their autistic children. Thank you.
Very well done, Tracy, and a very comprehensive presentation. Thank you so much.